Today we're going to be talking gunnery command and gunline armies in Warhammer 40k, an overview of basic strategies to get a bit more out of your firepower in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So last week we talked a little bit about the various different army archetypes in Warhammer 40k, and one of the most classic types of armies that you'll see on the battlefields is the gunline. Roughly speaking, I'd define a gunline as an army that's primarily focused on destroying the foe just by taking large amounts of firepower, whether that's on tanks or infantry, or any other platforms. In this video we'll talk about the various different types of gunline that you can field, deploying them for battle in-game, a brief discussion of character auras and synergy, and some tips for commanding a gunline force in a game of 40k. Quite a lot to cover there, so let's jump right into it and talk about gunlines in general. So we mentioned a bit of this in the video last week. Gunlines are generally going to be focused on taking the heaviest firepower they can get point for point, as well as combining that with decent defense units. Things like big battle tanks are exactly what you'd expect to find. In general, by focusing on this sort of thing, it means that gunlines should typically win most direct shooting engagements if the only things in 40k were literally two armies just setting up on a big empty battlefield and taking shots at each other. You've invested all your points and energy in the firepower and defense, so this should be the edge over the opponent. For weaknesses, generally they're typically not quite as good at mobility or the objective scoring game, as at least the vast majority of the time you're going to be giving up the points in mobility to invest more points in big, slow, heavy units that are just good at annihilating the foe. Line of sight blocking terrain can also be a potential weakness as well, as that can stop you shooting your normal guns at the opponent, meaning that you're going to have to deal with those units by using ignores line of sight weaponry or dealing with them in close combat or at close range. Typical factions who play gunlines are of course the Tau, who have little to no melee threat, Space Marines, particularly Imperial Fists or Iron Hands, Dark Angels, who are very good at standing still with their reroll wands, Imperial Guard, Adeptus Mechanicus, various Orc builds including their massive smasher gun list that they can do at the moment, and Looter Bombs, Necrons, who I'm sure will be getting buffs to many of their abilities soon, Sisters of Battle, and Craft Worlds. I'm not saying that other factions can't do it, but I think that these guys tend to signify the ones that are more dedicated to building an army that's almost entirely shooting. You can get different variants of gunlines, including ones that advance towards the enemy, such as an Ultramarines, Aggressor and Intercessor line, backed up by all of their characters. You can get synergy castles, where you stack multiple overlapping buffs from various different characters to make the units around them just perform on an entirely different level. You can have gunlines that either focus on the infantry or the heavy armour, entire gunlines of Leman Russ battle tanks, or say an Imperial Guard infantry gunline, where you could be having to deal with 300 lasguns that are going to chew through hordes and likely have a lot of heavy weapons hiding in the squads. Or you can have lists that focus very heavily on artillery, such as Imperial Fists or Imperial Guard. So presumably you've taken a list that involves a lot of high efficiency firepower units depending on whatever your faction brings. Let's talk a little bit about deploying it in game. Gunlines may be focused on mainly the damage dealers, but having a fair few units of chaff infantry for board control, screening and moving to objectives is a really solid advantage for a gunline if you can get them. Basically in 40k the game is quite a lot about zones of control, and pretty much the closer you are to enemy units, the more damage they'll be dealing to you, whether that's in assault or close range powerful weaponry. If you don't have any chaff or screening units, that means that the units that are going to be close to the enemy army are going to be important ones with decent firepower. If you can put out a lot of screens though, then they'll be the ones that can die first. While they're there gumming up the midfield, you can also have them secure objectives and things in the early game, which is something that gunlines might struggle with. Plus they can also act as deep strike screening for any enemy units that are coming in from reserve. By deploying them intelligently, you can make sure that there aren't any gaps so no one can drop down within 9 inches of those units. Behind these, I'd typically be wanting to set up some midfield troops or some of the more durable elements of my firebase. Things like Primaris Intercessors or Aggressors are good examples of this. They're more durable per point than some of the biggest and most fragile elements in the gunline that want to be hiding at the back. And they're also sort of mixed role units as well, so if the enemy punctures the screens and engages you in direct combat, they can also hit them back in combat pretty hard, or maybe even countercharge if it's advantageous. They can be another very good tool to get your opponent to stay well back from the heavy damage dealing units right at the back of the army, who should hopefully be using their firepower to win the game as a whole. Those units basically need to be optimised in terms of placing them with good line of sight and near anything that's going to give them important buffs, such as Space Marine Captains for example. It's going to vary a lot depending on what the exact unit is, but they basically need to make sure that they're firing all game long, as this will be the main area where you've invested the most points in your army. If they're direct fire weapons, make sure that they're either in range or can move into range on turn 1, and make sure that they have good line of sight or can move into good line of sight on turn 1. For things like flying tanks and stuff, you could easily just park them behind a ruin to keep them safe turn 1, and then move them to be able to shoot the enemy once you get to your own turn. Obviously all of these elements need to consider terrain. Chaff troops up front should ideally be skulking in cover wherever they can. Durable midfield units having a cover save would usually help, and things like ignores line of sight weapons could be sat at the back out of line of sight in a ruin, preventing your opponent from ever targeting them. As a very simplistic example, we've got a bit of a mock deployment zone here. Our own deployment zone is lower than the dotted line, and above that is the midfield, and towards the top of the screen would be the enemy army, but although we don't know where they're setting up yet. We've used our scouts, who can set up outside the deployment zone, to form a bit of a screen. There's one unit that's hiding in a line of sight blocking ruin on the left, and there's another unit that's just strung out to take up maximal space and deny any enemies deep striking on the right. I would actually think about measuring between the two units to make sure that there's no gaps in the 9-inch bubbles, meaning that the opponent won't be able to come in from reserves between them. We've got a next line of screening behind that, which are 15 Primaris Intercessors in 3 squads of 5, who can think about just standing there and shooting with bolter discipline, or moving up into the midfield if you want to try and take objectives. A couple of Space Marine characters right in the centre, providing their buffs hopefully so both the Intercessors and the backfield units. Some of our main firebase are 2 Repulse Executioners, who are happily staying well back seeing as they've got very long range on their guns, and they could potentially think about gradually moving up as the game goes on. And we've got a couple of very long range Whirlwinds that are skulking in the corner of the board. One's out of line of sight behind a ruin, and the other one's in the very corner, so hopefully will be outranging most enemies shooting. I know this is only a very rough example, but I hope it just clarifies what I was talking about. Next, I'd like to have a bit of a talk about synergy castles, basically things that have multiple characters and make the units around them perform extremely well, both in terms of offense and defense. These are so strong because each of the characters that you add will give a certain buff to the units around them, whether it's Space Marine Captains re-rolling 1s to hit, Space Marine Lieutenants re-rolling 1s to wound, things like Ironfather Fyros giving infantry a 5+ invul save, or maybe things like Chapter Ancients giving Marines shooting when they die, or Tech Marines or Apothecaries healing up all the units. Basically, this can lead to a situation where you're getting far more utility out of the units that you put in the range of all of these characters, because the buffs are sort of synergistic. So say for example, if you have a captain and a lieutenant, you're buffing the same unit twice, you're actually getting slightly better than you would have got with either individual one of those on their own. This was one of the reasons why the old Gilliman rules with his 4 rerolls to hit and wound were quite so problematic, because he basically did this effect all by himself, and it meant that any units in his aura were worth about twice as strong in terms of the amount of shooting, which made Space Marine units very hard to balance indeed. Most armies seem to have access to something like this, whether it's Space Marines with all the characters I mentioned, maybe Imperial Guard with a Master of Ordnance and the Old Grudge's Warlord trait to give a bunch of rerolls to artillery, or something like Sisters of Battle with characters giving +1 to their Shield of Faith rule, and maybe Canonesses or Junith Arita giving them multiple rerolls. With any of these setups, deployment is another very big issue. Basically where you set these guys up, which flank that you put them on, or whether you put them down the centre, could change the game, and you really want them in a gun line to be ensuring that your tanks are still going to get good line of sight and good range on enemy units while not being overexposed. I'd consider being a bit reactive to whatever army you're fighting. If you're thinking about fighting an onrushing assault army, then they can afford to be a bit further back most of the time. If you're fighting a highly mobile army, you might want to be a bit more central, so they're not just going to be able to get outranged and ignored for large parts of the game. And if you're facing an army with a whole ton of snipers, then it's worth thinking about trying to use line of sight blocking terrain to keep the characters safe, as they can usually still deliver their buffs, even if they're hiding out of line of sight in a ground floor ruin or something. I'd also bear in mind that you don't necessarily actually need to set everything up in perfect buff range right from turn 1. Provided your units are fairly happy moving and firing, then you can set up your characters and units a little bit separately, and then move everything into optimal buffing range turn 1. One particularly potent example of this are things like flyers, where you could set up a flyer 20 inches away from your characters, as they can't move any less than that, and then turn 1 the flyer can jump into character buffing range and gain access to all of those rerolls for a turn, so you get a particularly devastating alpha strike on turn 1. Finally, most of the things that provide synergies like this tend to double up as fighty characters that have powerful rules in close combat, and they can be a reasonable countercharge element for when the enemy gets close to the castle. It might be a bit of a last-ditch attempt to repel the enemy, but if you've got foes closing in, then you could deal a lot of damage with a mass charge from say a Space Marine Captain, Lieutenant, Tech Marine and Chaplain. provided it's cheap enough, then sometimes it can even be worth giving them basic combat upgrades, such as a Power Fist on a Space Marine Captain, as it's very cheap and gives him a massive boost to his melee power, even if Assault isn't his primary role in your army list. Talking of countercharge elements, it can certainly be helpful to have some non-big shooter units to support a gunline, though bear in mind that each one of these that you wind up picking up, you are diluting the raw amount of firepower and damage dealing that your army can do as a whole. A few strong countercharge elements can be really strong to have in an army, just because against some units close combat is a far more efficient way of dealing with them rather than shooting. Things like certain Eldar units who can get up to very high -1s to hit in the shooting phase, but might be fairly easy to destroy in the fight phase. As we said, things that are skulking out of line of sight in ground floor ruins, and need to get some troops in to go and clear them out, or even just to have the elements there to stop the opponent exposing their army too much to them, and hopefully make their scary damage dealing units stay well away from your tanks that are dealing damage from the back. They can certainly double up sometimes. These aggressors are pretty excellent in the shooting phase, and they also have very decent melee threat as well, so are strong elements to include in a gunline army on the front line. A few deep strikers or outflankers could be pretty handy as well, either to tie up or get in the way of other enemy units, or pick on very isolated targets of opportunity, or even just literally to jump on objectives that are in the opponent's backfield. For example, in a guard army, a few cheap squads of Tempestus Scions might not go amiss, even if they're literally just 35-point squads with hotshot lasguns, designed to drop on objectives for a turn or so to earn victory points, or even just to act as some deployable screens or movement blockers to get in the way of the opponent's army. Finally, we mentioned Ignore's line of sight before. I think that if you can put them into an army, then it's really helpful. In general, you'll be paying a lot more per damage output compared with direct fire elements, but it really can help solve the issue of things hiding in terrain. That's why we tend to see quite a lot of things like Thunderfire cannons, Tau Smart missiles, or Imperial Guard artillery in competitive lists for those factions. So let's talk a little bit about commanding a gunline army in-game. In the movement and deployment phases, you're going to have to try and react to your opponent's army with positioning, ranges, and how aggressive you're going to be. If they have melee threats, then you're generally going to be wanting to stay back or screen them out with chaff. If they don't have many melee threats, then perhaps you can actually be a little bit more aggressive yourself and try and bully your way to the midfield and take any objectives there. If you have mobile units that are happy to move and fire, you can even think about deliberately outranging your opponent's shorter ranged elements, and then in your turn you could potentially move into effective range yourself and open fire to get the first strike. In terms of the shooting phase, I have made an entire video on this before, so feel free to give it a look after this one. But some of the best general principles I'd go with are first to have a vague plan of what sort of things you need to try and eliminate in that shooting phase, try and have a good appreciation of your army's firepower output, and choose the units that most need to die that turn and try and get it done. When you're shooting with the units in your own army, I typically start with the units that have the least opportunities, so say if you had a unit of scouts that could literally only fire at one enemy infantry unit, it makes sense to fire that one first, because then you gain the information of how well they did against that unit, and they couldn't have fired against anything else anyway. Once you've done those sort of units, I typically want to fire weapons that have got big swingy amounts of damage, and put them into the most intact targets that I want to kill that turn. Things like an Onager Dunecrawler's neutron laser. You can very easily get very high amounts of damage out of it, but you can very easily get nothing as well, so in general I'd want to be firing these fairly early on to find out exactly what sort of damage they got, give them the potential to one-shot some vehicles if they get lucky, and if not, then go and clean up with smaller amounts of firepower. Towards the end of the shooting phase, I'd want to be firing the smaller, more reliable weapons, things with fixed number of shots, typically 1 damage weapons and things that you pretty much can guarantee that you're going to get a wound or two, but probably not much more than that. I'd also typically leave things with Ignore's line of sight and great range till the end, because they can be chosen to target pretty much anything on the board, so you can basically see what sort of damage you've done to the enemy army and use that last bit of firepower exactly where it's going to be the most effective to winning the game. I sort of messed up the bullet points on the side a little bit here, but the last thing that I really wanted to talk about was not to get too focused on just literally destroying the enemy towards the end of the game. You're generally going to have to think about pushing up and securing some objectives in the midfield, particularly if the opponent's been getting a bit in the lead in victory points in the first few turns, due to your army wanting to castle up a little bit more at the back compared with theirs. Basically, if you do start moving forward with important elements of your army, it is likely that they might get a little bit less firepower due to moving, and they might be a little bit more exposed, either to enemy counterattacks or to them being tied up in close combat or something. You're going to have to weigh up that risk, but you certainly can lose entire games just because you've held them back for too long. One of the last tournament games I went to before the lockdown, I had my army, I believe, completely tabled by an Imperial Fists player who was using a very artillery-focused gunline, and it meant that I'd been racking up the points on the midfield objectives right from the start, and he'd backed right off into one corner. I think there was one turn where I was just surprised that he didn't start moving forward with units when it was clear that my army was on its last legs, but he stayed for one more turn's optimal firepower. He did destroy the army, but I think he would have anyway, and that crucial turn of not scoring objectives actually I think turned the game into a loss for him. I guess it's impossible to know with absolute certainty, but just bear in mind that as well as being too rash with a gunline army, then being too conservative can also cost you games as well, particularly if they're sequential objective scoring turn on turn. So I think that brings us to the end of our discussion of gunlines. If you have any important insights that you think I've missed, or if you've got any faction specific advice for your own faction's gunline, please let us know down in the comments. It'd be great to hear. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more discussion of strategy. And if you've been enjoying my content a lot, I'd just like to mention the channel's Patreon page. It is what allows me to put quite so much time into making these videos, so if you're enjoying them quite a bit, then any support is greatly appreciated, as well as allowing me to focus so much time on this thing. There's also a few other benefits for Patreons, such as being able to see some new videos early, voting on what sort of videos come next for the channel, and the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to one Patreon. If any of that sounds interesting, or you'd just like to help keep these videos coming, then the Patreon link is down in the description of the video. I'd just like to say a big thank you to all my supporters, particularly including a certain Mr. Fireblood who sponsored this episode. In any case, thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.